Hello there and welcome back. Tonight we are going to ride slowly toward Wapiti, into the colder northern air of Red Dead Redemption 2, and sit with the lore of Rains Fall. Not as a side character passing through Arthur Morgan's story, but as one of the gentlest and saddest figures in the whole game. Rains Fall is a chief, a father, a diplomat, a widower in spirit, long before his body is gone, and a man trying to hold a people together while every force around him teaches the young that patience has failed. His story is quiet, but it is not small. It carries land, memory, ceremony, broken promises, stolen sacred objects, a son he cannot save, and a future that survives only by leaving. So settle in gently. Let the mountain wind soften. Let the campfires at Wapiti burn low. Tonight we are following the entire lore of Rains Fall. Slowly, like a voice trying to keep peace, while the world keeps choosing violence. Rains Fall first matters, because he is not introduced as a fighter, even though his life is surrounded by conflict. He is introduced as a leader trying to prevent conflict from consuming what remains of his people. The Wapiti are under pressure from the United States Army, from government promises that keep shifting, from land interests, from oil, from disease, from hunger, and from the despair of younger men who no longer believe careful words can protect anyone. Rains Fall stands inside all of this with dignity. But dignity is not the same as safety. That is the tragedy of him. He is wise in a world where wisdom has very little power left. The Wapiti people in Red Dead Redemption 2 are a fictional native community. But their story is built from recognisable historical wounds, forced relocation, broken treaties, reservation life, military pressure, resource theft, and the erasure of sacred relationships to land. Rains Fall carries that history on his back. He is not only a grieving father or a peaceful old man. He is a chief standing at the end of too many negotiations with men who can sign paper in the morning and violate its spirit by afternoon. His calmness is not naivety. It is endurance after watching anger repeatedly used against his people. His name itself feels gentle and heavy. Rains Fall sounds like weather, like patience, like something that descends softly but changes the earth over time. It is the opposite of Eagle Flies, his son's name, which rises upward with motion, urgency, and spirit. The two names almost tell the story before the dialogue does. The father is falling rain, trying to nourish, cool, and endure. The son is flight, fierce and high, desperate to act before the ground is taken completely. Their conflict is not only political, it is written into the poetry of their names. Rains Fall is the chief of the Wapiti, and that position makes him responsible for more than his own pain. A private man could rage, flee, break, or surrender to despair. A chief must think of children, elders, the sick, the hungry, the future, and the consequences of every young man's anger. Rains Fall's restraint comes from leadership. He is not calm because nothing hurts him. He is calm because everything hurts him, and he still has to decide what will keep the most people alive. The Wapiti Reservation is in Ambarino, a northern region of the map that feels colder, higher, and more isolated than the early Heartlands. Its placement matters. The Wapiti are not living at the centre of power. They are pushed outward, up into difficult land, under watch and pressure. Their camp is not like Horseshoe Overlook, where the Van der Linde gang temporarily hides by choice. Wapiti is a restricted home shaped by policy, displacement, and the constant sense of being controlled by outside authority. The physical atmosphere of Wapiti helps tell Rainsfall's story. The air feels thin and cold. The mountains stand around the reservation like old witnesses. The tents, paths, horses, people and fires suggest a community trying to remain itself under conditions designed to shrink it. Unlike Dutch's camps, Wapiti does not feel like a travelling outlaw family choosing the next hideout. It feels like a people being held in place while the surrounding world decides how much more can be taken. Rainsfall's relationship to land is one of the deepest parts of his lore. For him, land is not only property, not only acreage, not only a thing to trade or drill beneath. It is memory, identity, ceremony, ancestry, and responsibility. This is one of the great divides between him and the powers pressuring Wapiti. The army and industrial men see land through control and extraction. Rainsfall sees land through belonging and stewardship. When those visions collide, paper agreements are rarely enough to protect the older one. The oil under or near Wapiti land becomes the material form of this collision. Oil is not just a resource in the story. It is the smell of the future, the black underground wealth that makes powerful men suddenly interested in land they previously neglected. Cornwall's world of industrial extraction and the army's willingness to pressure the tribe turn Wapiti into a place where spiritual belonging is forced to argue with profit. Rainsfall understands that the issue is not only one bad kernel. It is a system that looks at sacred ground and sees fuel. Colonel Favours represents that system in its cruel local form. He is arrogant, dismissive, and willing to provoke conflict while presenting himself as order. Favours does not need to understand Rainsfall deeply, because power has taught him he does not have to. His contempt is not only personal prejudice, it is institutional confidence. He can insult, pressure, withhold, and provoke because the structure behind him makes his choices dangerous. Rainsfall must negotiate with a man who has both weapons and contempt. Captain Monroe is important because he complicates the army's image. Monroe is not the same as Favours. He is more sympathetic, more decent, and more willing to help Rainsfall and the Wapiti. But his decency also reveals the limits of individual goodness inside a corrupt system. Monroe can carry messages, assist, and risk his position, yet he cannot transform the larger machinery by himself. Rainsfall's story needs Monroe, because it shows that even good men within bad structures may not have enough power to save the people they know are being wronged. Evelyn Miller introduces Arthur more directly to Rainsfall and Eagle Flies in St. Denis, and Miller's role is also important. He is a writer, an idealist, and a white intellectual who sympathises with native struggle. But sympathy from thinkers and writers is not the same as protection. Miller can see injustice and speak against it, but the Wapiti need more than understanding. They need land, safety, medicine, and the honouring of agreements. Rainsfall's world is full of people who can recognise wrong. Recognition alone does not stop it. The meeting in St. Denis during the Gilded Cage is subtle, because Rainsfall and Eagle Flies appear in a space of wealth, politics, and performance. Angelo Bronte's party is full of powerful men, social masks, and hidden negotiations. Rainsfall and Eagle Flies are present among people who may see them as a cause, inconvenience, curiosity, or bargaining problem. Their presence in that world highlights their isolation. They must enter rooms built by people who do not truly intend to listen. Eagle Flies is introduced alongside Rainsfall, and their contrast becomes the heart of the Wapiti storyline. Eagle Flies is young, angry, brave, and tired of humiliation. He has watched diplomacy fail. He has watched his people shrink under pressure. He has watched his father speak patiently while the army keeps tightening its grip. His anger is understandable. The story does not make him foolish in a simple way. It makes him tragic because he sees real injustice clearly, but his response is exactly what his enemies can use. Rainsfall's relationship with Eagle Flies is painful because both men love the same people and fear the same destruction. They do not disagree because one cares and the other does not. They disagree because they read the danger differently. Rainsfall believes open war will destroy the Wapiti faster. Eagle Flies believes restraint has already allowed destruction to continue. This is one of the strongest conflicts in the game because both positions have emotional truth. The father wants survival. The son wants dignity that does not feel like slow surrender. Arthur Morgan enters this conflict at the end of his own life, and that timing is crucial. A younger Arthur might have seen Rainsfall only through Dutch's needs, or only as another stranger asking for help. The dying Arthur is different. He is more open to listening, more aware of suffering, more suspicious of Dutch, and more haunted by the damage of violence. Rainsfall reaches Arthur when Arthur is finally capable of hearing him deeply. Rainsfall and Arthur are not obvious companions. One is a native chief trying to preserve his people through peace. The other is an outlaw who has spent his life committing violence for a false family dream. Yet they connect because both are tired men standing near endings. Rainsfall is near the end of a people's safety on their land. Arthur is near the end of his body. Both have loved younger men they cannot fully protect. Both have watched leaders and systems make ruin out of pride. The mission archaeology for beginners is the central quiet chapter of Rainsfall's lore. It is not a large shootout mission by design, even though violence can enter depending on choices. It begins with Arthur visiting Rainsfall at Wapiti, hearing him speak of the situation, and riding with him through the mountains. The pace matters. The mission slows everything down. It lets Rainsfall talk, gather herbs, point to plants, speak of his people, and reveal his grief without shouting. The herb gathering ride is one of the gentlest sequences in the whole game. Rainsfall stops to collect plants that can help his people, and Arthur follows. That action is simple, but it carries enormous meaning. The chief is not only a political leader, he is still tending to bodies. He knows medicine, land, and practical care. While Dutch plans robberies and Favours provokes war, Rainsfall gathers herbs. The contrast is beautiful. Leadership for him is not only speaking to power, it is knowing what might ease someone's pain. Those herbs are also a lesson in attention. Rainsfall sees the land as useful in a living, relational way. Plants are not just background, they are medicine, knowledge, inheritance, and responsibility. He teaches by noticing. Arthur, whose journal shows his own quiet attention to animals and plants, is unusually suited to receive this lesson. Rainsfall does not preach at him. He points to the land and lets the land become part of the teaching. The ride with Rainsfall includes a moment with wolves feeding on a dead horse, and the detail matters because it is handled with unusual restraint. Rainsfall does not demand that Arthur kill the wolves. Instead, Arthur can scare them away. The scene quietly values avoiding unnecessary killing. In a game full of violence, this tiny act feels almost radical. Rainsfall's influence bends Arthur toward restraint, even in a situation where violence would be easy and familiar. This moment with the wolves also reflects Rainsfall's larger philosophy. He is not weak. he does not refuse action. He simply chooses the least destructive action that still solves the immediate problem. Scaring wolves away from the path is not surrender, it is proportion. Rains Full understands the difference between force and excess. That difference is exactly what eagle flies, Dutch, Favours, and so many others struggle to preserve. During the ride, Rains Full speaks of his family and his people with a quiet grief that never feels theatrical. He has lost much already. His wife is gone, and he has seen children die. The elderly among his people are sick. The young are angry. He knows the army is provoking them. He understands that every option is narrowing. His sorrow is not a sudden emotional confession. It is the settled sorrow of a man who has spent years carrying bad news in both hands. Rains Full's grief as a father is central to his character. Eagle Flies is not only a political problem to him, he is his son. Every strategic decision is also a parental wound. When Eagle Flies risks himself, Rains Full is not simply afraid for a warrior, he is afraid for the child he raised. When Eagle Flies rejects patience, Rains Full does not only hear political disagreement, he hears the generational fracture of his own family, sharpened by the pressure of conquest. The idea of generational fracture is one of the most important parts of Rains Full's lore. The older generation remembers many defeats and has learned that survival may require restraint. The younger generation sees restraint as humiliation. The old fear annihilation through battle. The young fear annihilation through waiting. Rains Full stands between these fears. He is not blind to either one. He simply knows that if the young are provoked into open war, the army will have the excuse it wants. This is why Colonel Favours is so dangerous. He is not merely insulting the Wapiti. He is trying to create a situation where repression can be justified. Provocation is a political weapon. If the Wapiti respond violently, the army can claim order must be restored. Rains Full sees this trap. Eagle Flies sees the insult more immediately than the trap. Dutch sees opportunity. Arthur, by the time he rides with Rains Full, begins to see the trap too. The stolen sacred items in archaeology for beginners give this conflict spiritual weight. Rains Full learns that soldiers have taken sacred objects, including the shanupa, a ceremonial pipe. This is not a simple theft of property, it is a violation of ceremony, memory and dignity. The army is not only taking land or restricting movement, it is touching the inner life of the Wapiti with contempt. For Rains Full, recovering the sacred items is about restoring respect where the world has shown none. Arthur's choice during the recovery of the sacred items matters. If he retrieves them without killing soldiers, Rains Full responds with gratitude and gives the owl feather trinket. The trinket is less important as a reward than as a symbol. It represents restraint, honoured by a man who's been begging everyone around him to understand restraint. Arthur can prove in a small but meaningful way that he heard Rains Full. He can act without making more bodies. If violence occurs, the mission still moves forward, but the moral texture changes. Rains Full has asked for care, not war. The soldiers may be wrong, but killing them feeds the very cycle he fears. This is one reason the mission is so strong. It does not simply ask whether Arthur can win. It asks whether Arthur can move through danger without becoming another source of escalation. For Arthur, near the end of his life, that question matters deeply. The Chanupa and other sacred objects show that the Wapiti storyline is not only about physical survival, it is about cultural survival. A people can be kept alive biologically while their ceremonies, language, land and sacred relationships are attacked. Rain's Fall understands that survival without memory is another kind of loss. This is why the stolen objects hurt so much. They represent an attempt to degrade the inner structure of the people, not only control their bodies. Arthur returning the items to Rain's Fall creates one of the game's softest moral exchanges. There is no grand celebration, no loud victory, no huge score. There is a quiet restoration of something sacred. In Arthur's late arc, this matters because he has spent so much of life taking. Here, he helps return. The difference is simple but profound. Rain's Fall gives Arthur a chance to use his skills not to rob, intimidate, or avenge, but to restore what was stolen. Captain Munro's connection to Rain's Fall deepens in honour amongst thieves. Munro tries to help by arranging for vaccines or medicine meant for the Wapiti, but the army's corruption and favours obstruction make even medicine into a battleground. This mission is important because it shows how cruelty can hide inside logistics. People are sick. Medicine exists. Power interferes. Rain's Fall's people are not dying because help is impossible. They are suffering because help is controlled by men who do not value them enough. Arthur stealing the vaccines for Munro and the Wapiti is another late act of redirected outlaw skill. He has robbed trains and coaches for Dutch, money and survival. Now he steals medicine for sick people. The action is still theft, but its moral direction changes. Rain's Fall's story helps Arthur repurpose the habits of his old life. He cannot become innocent, but he can turn his competence toward mercy. This is one of the quiet bridges between Rain's Fall and Arthur's redemption. Rain's Fall's gratitude toward Arthur is never naive. He does not suddenly imagine Arthur as pure. He sees a sick, violent, tired man who can still choose better. This is one of his gifts as a character. Rain's Fall looks at people with sadness and clarity, not flattery. He sees Eagleflies' courage and danger. He sees Dutch's manipulation. He sees Arthur's pain. He has lived long enough to know that people can be more than one thing at once. The conversation between Arthur and Rain's Fall about Arthur's sickness is one of the most tender parts of their connection. Rain's Fall recognises suffering without turning it into spectacle. He tells Arthur about loss, illness, and what remains when control is gone. Arthur, who often hides behind roughness, seems able to sit in that gentler space. Rain's Fall becomes one of the few people outside the gang who meets Arthur's dying self with calm rather than demand. This is why Rain's Fall feels almost spiritual in Arthur's last chapter. He is not a priest in Arthur's tradition, not a doctor, not a gang father, not an old lover, not a lawman. He is a grieving chief whose own story gives him authority to speak about endurance. His peace is not easy peace, it is scarred peace. That makes it credible. Arthur does not need comforting lies by chapter 6. He needs truth spoken softly. Rain's Fall's philosophy is often misunderstood as passivity, but the story shows something more difficult. He is not passive. He is active in a way that does not flatter violent men. He negotiates. He gathers medicine. He seeks help. He warns his son. He speaks to Arthur. He works with Munro. He tries to retrieve sacred items. He travels, pleads, teaches, and endures. His actions are constant. They simply do not look like the kind of action Dutch and eagle flies are drawn toward. The difference between action and violence is central to Rain's fall. The world around him often treats violence as the only serious form of action. Eagle Flies wants to strike the army. Dutch wants to provoke conflict for advantage. Favours wants an excuse to crush resistance. Rain's fall acts through patience, care, diplomacy, and preservation. The tragedy is not that he does nothing. The tragedy is that the world keeps rewarding the forms of action that destroy people. Dutch's involvement in the Wapiti storyline is one of the most painful parts of Rain's Fall's lore. Dutch sees Eagle Flies' anger and begins to use it. He encourages conflict because it can distract the army and help the Van der Linde gang. This is one of Dutch's clearest moral failures. He wraps manipulation in the language of resistance, but he is not truly serving the Wapiti. He is serving his own collapsing plan. Rain's Fall understands this danger more clearly than Eagle Flies does at first. Dutch's manipulation of Eagle Flies is especially cruel because Eagle Flies' anger is justified. Dutch does not invent the injustice. The army is genuinely harming the Wapiti. Favours is genuinely corrupt and provocative. The land and sacred life of the tribe are genuinely under threat. That is what makes Dutch's behaviour so ugly. He takes a real cause and bends it toward his own needs. He uses truth as bait. Rain's Fall's opposition to war is therefore not opposition to dignity. It is opposition to being used. He knows that powerful men can provoke the oppressed into action and then punish them for acting. He knows that Dutch, whatever his words, is not the one who will pay the highest price if the Wapiti are crushed. Eagle Flies hears Dutch's supporters' validation. Rain's Fall hears the old sound of outsiders turning native pain into their own tool. Arthur's growing distrust of Dutch becomes sharper through Rain's Fall. By chapter 6, Arthur can see how Dutch is pushing Eagle Flies toward danger. This matters because Rain's Fall gives Arthur an external moral reference point. It is one thing for Arthur to doubt Dutch because the gang is suffering. It is another to watch Dutch exploit another people's struggle. Rain's Fall's presence helps Arthur see Dutch from outside the family myth. The mission of Rage Unleashed is a turning point because Eagle Flies wants to rescue captured horses from the army, and Dutch becomes involved. Rain's Fall does not want escalation, but his son and the younger warriors are already moving toward action. The title itself matters. Rage is unleashed, not carefully guided. Once anger begins moving through weapons, it becomes harder for a father, a chief, or anyone else to control. Rain's Fall's fear is not cowardice, it is knowledge of momentum. The stolen horses are important because they are not only property. Horses are movement, independence, wealth, and dignity. For the Wapiti, their seizure by the army is another humiliation and another practical restriction. Eagle Flies' desire to retrieve them is understandable, but the army's provocation is designed to make every act of dignity look like aggression. This is the trap Rain's Fall keeps seeing. Every stolen thing becomes bait. When Dutch supports Eagle Flies, he appears to be helping the Wapiti resist injustice. But Dutch's timing and motivation are poisonous. He needs chaos. He needs the army distracted. He needs new pressure on the world around him to create space for his own escape. This is why Rain's Fall's storyline is so important to Dutch's decline. It shows Dutch no longer merely endangering his own family. He is willing to endanger another vulnerable community to buy time. Arthur's position in A Rage Unleashed is uncomfortable because he can understand eagle flies and rains fall at once. He knows what it is to be angry at injustice. He knows what it is to follow a leader. He knows what it is to believe action will restore dignity. But he is also beginning to understand how easily action can be manipulated by men with larger plans. Arthur is caught between sympathy and dread. Rains Fall's dread grows because every young warrior who follows eagle flies is someone he may lose. A chief does not count casualties as numbers. He knows them as sons, nephews, cousins, friends, future elders, future fathers. Every provoked fight risks more than tactical defeat. It risks the shape of the tribe's future. This is why his pleas carry such weight. He is not begging for comfort. He is begging the young not to let the army choose the battlefield and the meaning of their deaths. The tragedy is that Rainsfall's patience has already been made to look weak by the very forces attacking him. When diplomacy is mocked, treaties broken, medicine withheld, sacred objects stolen, and land threatened, the peaceful leader becomes easy for the young to distrust. They ask, "What has peace brought us?" Rainsfall has no easy answer because the question is fair. His wisdom is not simple because the world has made peace nearly unbearable. This is the emotional genius of Rainsfall and Eagle Flies. The game does not reduce the conflict to wise father and foolish son. Eagle Flies is not wrong to be furious. Rainsfall is not wrong to fear war. Both are responding to real violence. The tragedy is that oppression creates situations where every option has been poisoned. Fight and be crushed. Wait and be slowly erased. Rainsfall's pain comes from knowing that both roads can lead to loss. Colonel Favors thrives in that poisoned space. He provokes, obstructs, and positions himself as guardian of order while helping create disorder. He is the kind of antagonist who does not need to be complex to be effective. His function is to reveal how institutional power can behave with petty cruelty and still call itself lawful. Rainsfall's dignity beside Fabius's arrogance makes the moral difference clear without needing melodrama. Captain Monroe's fear for his own safety also shows how dangerous it is to oppose such power from within. Monroe tries to do right, but Favors can punish him. Helping the Wapiti puts Monroe at risk because the institution does not want conscience interfering with policy. Rainsfall's alliance with Monroe is therefore bittersweet. It proves that some individuals care, but it also proves that caring individuals can be isolated. Arthur helping Monroe escape later reflects this same theme. The moral world around Rainsfall is full of people trying to survive systems bigger than themselves. Monroe needs help because decency has made him vulnerable. The Wapiti need help because their rights and bodies are being violated. Arthur needs help because his life is ending and his moral foundation is collapsing. Rainsfall stands at the centre of these intersecting vulnerabilities with quiet strength. The name Wapiti itself, meaning elk in some indigenous languages, adds a natural resonance to the tribe's presence. The game uses the name for its fictional community, and the elk connection gives the people an identity tied to the land and animal life of the region. Rainsfall's own manner often feels aligned with that natural dignity. He is not loud, but he is rooted. He belongs to the mountains in a way the army never can, no matter how many uniforms stand there. The Wapiti speaking Lakota in the game adds another layer of cultural texture, though the tribe itself is fictional. This detail matters because language is one of the ways a people remains itself. Even in a story told largely through English, the presence of native language resists total absorption. Rain's Foal's people are not simply an idea of suffering. They have voices, names, ceremony, and a community life that exists beyond the needs of Arthur's story. Still, the representation is not without complexity. Rain's Fall can be seen as part of a familiar narrative pattern, the elder who counsels peace while the younger warrior seeks battle. The game uses that contrast because it is dramatically powerful, but it also risks simplicity. What makes Rain's Fall work despite that risk is the depth of his grief and the specificity of his political understanding. He is not a vague wise elder. He is a leader making impossible calculations under colonial pressure. Rain's Fall's wisdom is not mystical decoration, it is historical intelligence. He knows what happens when the army can label resistance as rebellion. He knows what happens when powerful men want resources. He knows what happens when young men die faster than elders can teach. He knows because he has been watching it happen. His quietness comes from experience, not from being detached from reality. This is why his scenes with Arthur feel grounded rather than preachy. Rain's Fall does not float above the world. He is tired. He is worried. He is grieving. He still gathers herbs and speaks to a sick man, because that is what care looks like when grand solutions fail. He does not solve Arthur's life. He gives Arthur a way to think about pain without turning it into more violence. Arthur's tuberculosis makes him unusually receptive to Rain's Fall's teaching. A healthy Arthur might have heard the words and moved on. A dying Arthur is already being forced to understand limits. He cannot shoot tuberculosis. He cannot rob enough money to outrun it. He cannot intimidate it into leaving. Rain's Fall's worldview, built around endurance and restraint, meets Arthur at the moment when force has stopped being the answer to his deepest problem. This is one reason Rain's Fall belongs near Sister Calderon in Arthur's spiritual landscape. Both offer forms of gentleness late in the story. Sister Calderon gives Arthur a place to admit fear. Rain's Fall gives Arthur a model of grief that does not become revenge. Both help Arthur move away from Dutch's loud language and toward quieter truths. Neither saves his body. Both help shape the soul of his ending. Rain's Fall's effect on Arthur is subtle but real. After spending time with him, Arthur sees Dutch's actions toward eagle flies more clearly. He sees that helping the Wapiti does not mean feeding a doomed fight. He sees that mercy can be practical. He sees that a leader's duty is not to make followers feel brave, but to keep them alive if possible. These lessons matter because Arthur is deciding, in his final days, what kind of loyalty still deserves him. The relationship between Rain's Fall and Dutch is not symmetrical. Dutch speaks loudly of freedom and resistance, but Rain's Fall is the one whose people are actually facing dispossession as a nation. Dutch uses the language of oppression to justify outlaw survival. Rain's Fall lives the reality of oppression without the luxury of romanticising it. This contrast makes Dutch's speeches feel smaller and more selfish in Chapter 6. Dutch's treatment of eagle flies is especially revealing because Dutch likes young loyal men. He understands how to make them feel chosen. Arthur, John and others were shaped by that power. Eagle flies is not part of Dutch's family, but Dutch recognises the heat in him and uses it. Rain's Fall sees his son being drawn into another man's story, and that is almost unbearable. A father can fight an enemy. It is harder to fight a charismatic ally who tells the son exactly what his wounded pride wants to hear. Eaglefly's courage is real. He is not a coward, not a fool, and not a mere pawn without agency. That is part of the tragedy. Dutch uses him because there is something real to use. Bravery, pain, anger, love for his people, hatred of humiliation. Rain's Fall does not deny his son's courage. He fears where courage will be led. Courage without a survivable path can become a gift handed to the enemy. The oil fields battle, where Eaglefly's is mortally wounded, is the terrible fulfillment of Rain's Fall's fear. Dutch's escalating chaos, army violence, Eaglefly's bravery, and Arthur's involvement all converge in a scene where the son saves Arthur and is shot. Eaglefly's final injury is not meaningless, because he acts with courage, but it is devastating, because it is exactly the kind of loss Rain's Fall tried to prevent. Eaglefly's saving Arthur gives his death another layer. The young man Dutch, helped lead into danger, uses his last strength to protect Arthur, the very man who has been learning from Rain's Fall. This makes the tragedy painfully intertwined. Arthur owes his life, briefly, to the son Rain's Fall cannot keep alive. By then, Arthur is dying anyway, but the sacrifice still matters. Eaglefly's gives Arthur more time to finish the choices that remain. Rain's Fall holding Eaglefly's as he dies is one of the quietest heartbreaks in Red Dead Redemption 2. The chief, who has tried so hard to avoid war, receives his dying son in his arms. There is no argument left, no political debate, no strategy. Only a father and a son at the end of everything they could not reconcile in time. Rain's Fall's grief here is almost too heavy for words, because it is both personal and collective. He loses his child, and his people lose one of their fiercest young leaders. Eaglefly's final wound also proves that Rain's Fall's caution was not cowardice. He understood the cost. He saw the trap. He knew that even brave resistance could be turned into justification for more violence against the Wapiti. His son's death does not make Eaglefly's wrong to hate injustice, but it does show the brutal accuracy of the father's fear. The tragedy is not that one man was simply right and the other wrong. The tragedy is that the world punished both love and courage. Arthur's collapse after the oil fields connects his body to the Wapiti tragedy. He coughs, weakens, and is brought back from the edge, while Eaglefly's dies from the battle. The scene places two doomed sons near each other. Arthur, Dutch's adopted son in spirit, and Eaglefly's, Rain's Fall's actual son. Both have been used by charismatic or powerful men. Both are brave. Both are dying. The parallel is soft, but devastating. Rain's Fall and Dutch also become inverted fathers through this moment. Rain's Fall tries to prevent his son's death and loses him. Dutch keeps pushing his sons into danger and increasingly abandons them when they no longer serve his story. Rain's Fall's grief is the grief of a father who loved too much to spend his child. Dutch's decay is the decay of a father figure who spends sons while calling it loyalty. Arthur can feel the difference by then. After Eaglefly's dies, Rain's Fall's storyline becomes even quieter. There is no grand revenge mission where he throws away his principles and becomes a warrior. He remains what he has been, grieving, dignified, broken, but not transformed into the thing that harmed him. This is one of his strongest qualities. The story allows him sorrow without making him abandon himself. His son dies, and still, Rain's Fall does not become Dutch. The Wapiti are eventually forced to leave, and in the epilogue Rains Fall can be encountered at the Annesburg train station. This meeting with John Marston in 1907 is brief but deeply important. Rains Fall says his people went to Canada, and that he has come back but is not fully sure why. That uncertainty is heartbreaking. He survives, but survival has not given him a clean homecoming. He returns like a man drawn by memory to a place that cannot restore what was lost. Annesburg is a perfect place for this epilogue encounter because it is an industrial mining town, smoky, harsh, and tied to the same world of extraction that helped destroy Wapiti's safety. Seeing Rains Fall there, waiting for a train, places him beside modern industry and movement. The chief of a displaced people stands in a town built around digging wealth from the earth. The image is quiet but loaded. The world that took so much from him is still running on tracks and smoke. Rains Fall speaking with John also links him to the life Arthur saved. John is alive because Arthur used his final strength to help him escape. Rains Fall knows Arthur, and John knows Arthur differently. Their conversation creates a small bridge between two survivors of Arthur's last chapter. Rains Fall carries the loss of eagle flies. John carries the debt of Arthur's sacrifice. Both men stand in the aftermath of a story that gave them survival, but not simple peace. The epilogue meeting is also one of the few moments where John touches the Wapiti tragedy directly. John's main story, after Arthur centres on Beecher's hope, Abigail, Jack, and building a life. Rains Fall appears like a memory from Arthur's final months, a reminder that the world contains grief beyond the Marston family. This is important because Red Dead Redemption 2's epilogue is not only about personal redemption, it is about the traces of all the people the main story could not save. Rains Fall's statement about Canada is painfully complex. Canada means survival, distance, exile, and perhaps a thin kind of safety. It is not victory. It is not the restoration of Wapiti land. It is what remains when staying becomes impossible. The people endure by leaving. This is one of the saddest forms of survival, being alive somewhere else, because the place that made you who you are has been made unlivable. The fact that Rains Fall comes back and does not fully know why feels true to displacement. A person can leave for survival and still be pulled toward the lost place. Memory does not obey policy. Grief does not stay across a border. Rains Fall returns because something in him remains tied to the land, to eagle flies, to Wapiti, to the mountains, to the dead. Perhaps to the question of whether anything of home can still be felt there. He cannot fully explain it, because grief often moves before language. During the end credits, Rains Fall can be seen in a final quiet image, looking upward as an eagle flies overhead. The image is simple and powerful because it connects him back to eagle flies without needing words. Whether read as symbol, memory, spirit, or natural coincidence, the eagle becomes a way for the story to let the father look toward the sun. The man who tried to keep his child alive now watches the sky, and for a moment grief rises rather than only falls. That image completes the poetry of the names. Rains Fall watches an eagle fly. The father remains below. The sun is associated with upward motion, and the sky holds what the earth could not. It is one of the game's softest visual elegies. Rains Fall does not get justice in a full worldly sense. He does not get land restored, sun returned, promises honoured. He gets a moment of seeing, and the moment is fragile enough to hurt. Rains Fall's entire arc is therefore built around the cost of restraint. Usually stories ask whether violence costs too much. Rain's Fall asks whether restraint costs too much too. He chooses peace to save lives, and still loses his son. He chooses diplomacy, and still loses land. He chooses patience, and still watches the young lose faith. The story does not mock him for this. It simply shows the terrible unfairness of being wise in a world designed to punish your wisdom. At the same time, the story does not say his restraint was meaningless. Without Rain's Fall, more Wapiti may have died sooner. Without his efforts, Arthur may not have found certain late moral lessons. Without his dignity, Eaglefly's anger would have no counterweight. Without his survival, the epilogue would lose one of its saddest witnesses. Rain's Fall does not win, but he preserves something. Sometimes preservation is the only victory history allows. The word preserve matters for Rain's Fall. He preserves memory, ceremony, medicine, dignity, restraint, and the possibility that the Wapiti are more than the conflict imposed on them. The army wants to reduce them to a problem. Dutch wants to reduce them to an opportunity. Some younger warriors may reduce the moment to a call for battle. Rain's Fall keeps insisting on a fuller view. His people are not only their anger, they are elders, children, ceremonies, land, language, sickness, grief, and future. This fuller view is why he is one of the most morally important figures in Arthur's late story. Arthur has spent years inside Dutch's reductions. People become enemies, marks, fools, debts, family, traitors, or tools depending on Dutch's needs. Rain's Fall offers a different way of seeing. He sees systems, consequences, and humanity even under pressure. He helps Arthur understand that not every fight worth understanding is a fight worth escalating. The connection between Rain's Fall and Arthur also carries a fatherly tone, but not the same tone as Dutch or Hosea. Dutch is the intoxicating father of vision. Hosea is the practical father of craft and caution. Rain's Fall is a late spiritual father of grief and restraint. He does not raise Arthur, but he meets him at the point where Arthur most needs another model of manhood. Rain's Fall shows Arthur strength without domination. Strength without domination may be the key to Rain's Fall's character. Many powerful men in the game dominate. Dutch through charisma, Cornwall through money, Favours through rank, Micah through cruelty, the Pinkertons through law, gangs through guns. Rain's Fall's strength is different. It is the strength to continue caring without control, the strength to speak calmly while insulted, the strength to bury rage under responsibility, the strength to grieve without becoming the enemy. This does not make him perfect. His son sees limitations in him. The young men lose faith for reasons that make emotional sense. A leader committed to peace can seem unbearable when peace keeps failing. Rain's Fall's tragedy includes the possibility that no choice he made could fully save his people. This is not a story about a flawless elder who had all the answers. It is a story about a leader trying to choose the least destructive answer when every answer has been damaged. In that way, Rain's Fall is one of the game's clearest examples of tragic responsibility. He is responsible for choices, but not responsible for the unjust conditions that make all choices terrible. He can decide whether to negotiate or fight, but he did not create the system that steals land, withholds medicine, and provokes his son. The burden placed on him is unfair before he even begins carrying it. Yet he carries it because someone must. Arthur recognises burdens. He has carried Dutch's burdens for years. The dirty work, the violence, the protection, the chores, the rescues, the emotional labour of keeping a gang alive. But Arthur's burden served a false dream. Rainsfall's burden serves a people under threat. This comparison matters. Both men are tired, both men are responsible. But one is learning that his loyalty was misplaced, while the other is trying to keep loyalty rooted in actual communal survival. Rainsfall's tent at Wapiti is a quiet centre of leadership. Unlike Dutch's tent, it does not feel like a stage for ego. It feels like a place of counsel, worry, and responsibility. People come not to be dazzled, but to seek direction. The difference between these two leaders can be felt in their spaces. Dutch's space gathers charisma. Rainsfall's space gathers grief and duty. The Wapiti camp itself has a different silence from Van der Linde camps. Dutch's camps are noisy with jokes, songs, complaints, and performance. Wapiti feels more restrained, heavier, watched. Partly this is because of the late game chapter, partly because of the northern landscape, and partly because the community is under open pressure. The camp does not feel like a hideout, it feels like a people waiting for the next violation. This waiting is emotionally exhausting. Rainsfall's life is full of waiting for messages, waiting for the army's next move, waiting for medicine, waiting for his son to return safely, waiting for promises to be honoured, waiting for the young to listen, waiting for the next piece of bad news. Waiting can be as dramatic as fighting when the stakes are survival. Rainsfall teaches the weight of waiting. Eagle flies cannot bear that waiting. His whole body seems built for motion. He wants to act because action feels like dignity. Rainsfall understands the appeal, but he has seen what follows. This father-son conflict is also a conflict between timescales. Eagle Flies lives in the urgency of the insult now. Rainsfall lives in the long memory of what retaliation has cost before and will cost again. The army uses time differently. It can delay, withhold, postpone, promise, and pressure because institutions often win by exhausting people. Rainsfall is forced to fight not only bullets, but delays. Medicine delayed, treaty promises delayed, justice delayed, movement delayed. Delay becomes a weapon. Eagle Flies sees delay as proof that peace has failed. Rainsfall sees delay as a trap meant to provoke the impatient. The tragedy is that both readings are true. Delay is evidence of bad faith, and delay is bait. That is why Rainsfall's position is so painful. He knows the peace process is corrupt, yet he also knows that abandoning it for open violence may give the corrupt exactly what they want. He is not choosing between good and bad. He is choosing between two ways powerful men have arranged for his people to lose. The word law for Rainsfall must therefore include political context, not only personal biography. His story is about colonial pressure, resource extraction, military provocation, generational conflict, and cultural survival. To tell only the father-son tragedy would be too small. To tell only the political tragedy would be too cold. Rainsfall's greatness is that both are inseparable. The political is personal because the threatened nation includes his own son. Eagle Flies dies as both a political figure and a beloved son. A young warrior falls because of military violence, Dutch's manipulation, and his own brave choice. A father loses his child. A people lose a voice of resistance. Arthur loses someone who saved him. The moment cannot be placed in one category. Rainsfall's grief contains all categories at once, which is why it feels so deep. There is also a symbolic connection between eagle flies and Arthur. Both are sons of powerful father figures, though in different ways. Eagle Flies is the biological son of Rainsfall, but he is also pulled by Dutch's influence. Arthur is Dutch's adopted son in spirit, but he is learning from Rainsfall. The fathers cross over. Dutch pulls Eagle Flies toward violence. Rainsfall pulls Arthur toward restraint. One father loses a son, the other loses the illusion of being a true father at all. Arthur's final rejection of Dutch becomes more meaningful after seeing rains fall. He has seen what a grieving, responsible elder looks like. He has seen a leader who does not spend his son willingly. He has seen someone who can be wounded without making everyone else die for his pride. Dutch's failures become harder to excuse beside Rainsfall's example. The contrast is quiet, but devastating. Rainsfall is also one of the few characters who can make Arthur feel young and old at the same time. Arthur is 36, hardened, experienced, and dying. Beside Rainsfall, he is still a son, still learning, still being gently corrected by someone who has endured more than he can fully understand. But because Arthur is dying, he is also old before his time. Their conversations carry that strange equality, elder and dying man, chief and outlaw, teacher and student, both standing near loss. The way Rainsfall speaks is essential to his effect. He does not rush. He does not inflate every sentence. He lets pauses matter. In a game full of men shouting certainty, his measured voice feels like a different moral climate. He does not dominate a scene by volume. He changes the air by refusing the rhythm of panic. That refusal is one of his strengths. His calm voice also makes anger around him sound more dangerous. Eagle Flies' urgency, Dutch's persuasion, Father's contempt, and Arthur's roughness all become clearer beside Rainsfall's steadiness. This is a powerful storytelling technique. The quiet character reveals the loudness of others. Rainsfall does not need to condemn everyone. His presence makes their excess visible. The sacred pipe, the herbs, the wolves, the mountain ride, and the epilogue train station all build a pattern of softness around him. But that softness is surrounded by hard facts: stolen land, dead children, dead wife, sick elders, military theft, son's death, exile. This is why Rainsfall is not sentimental. Sentimentality would make softness easy. Rainsfall's softness survives in conditions that should have destroyed it. That survival gives it power. His grief over his wife and children, mentioned in conversation, deepens him beyond the Eagle Flies story. He has already lost family before the main tragedy reaches its final blow. Eagle Flies is not the first wound. He is the wound that breaks through the remaining defences. This history matters because it means Rainsfall's patience has not been untested. He has been living after loss for a long time. A leader who has buried family and still tries to prevent more graves is not weak. He is disciplined beyond what most violent men can imagine. Dutch responds to loss by making it fuel. Sadie responds to loss through vengeance. Eagle Flies responds to collective humiliation through attack. Rainsfall responds to loss by trying again and again to keep others from joining the dead. That is a harder path than it looks. The game also uses Rainsfall to show that wisdom does not guarantee success. This is a mature and painful idea. Many stories reward the wise elder, by making his path ultimately correct and effective. Red Dead Redemption 2 does not. Rains Fall sees much clearly and still loses. This does not discredit him, it indicts the world around him. Sometimes the problem is not that wise people fail to understand. Sometimes the problem is that power does not care what wisdom understands. The epilogue with John preserves Rains Fall as a survivor, and survival matters even without victory. He is not killed, his people are not entirely erased, they go to Canada. He remains able to speak of Arthur, eagle flies, and the past. That survival is fragile, melancholic, and incomplete, but it is real. Red Dead Redemption 2 often values partial survival because full victory is rare. Rains Fall embodies that difficult kind of endurance. When John meets him, Rains Fall recognises the connection to Arthur and remembers him kindly. This matters because Arthur's late goodness leaves traces in people beyond the gang. Rains Fall becomes one of the witnesses to the Arthur who tried to help. The outlaw's redemption is not public history, but it lives in private memories. John, Abigail, Jack, Sadie, Charles, the Downs family, and Rains Fall. The chief carries one piece of that final Arthur. The conversation also lets John hear of eagle flies and the Wapiti's fate, tying the epilogue back to the unresolved wounds of Chapter 6. John's life has moved into building a ranch and family, but Rains Fall reminds him that many stories did not receive that kind of home-building ending. Beecher's hope is a fragile promise. Wapiti is a lost home. Placing these ideas near each other makes the epilogue more morally textured. Rains Fall boarding or waiting for a train in Annisburg also carries symbolic weight. Trains in Red Dead Redemption 2 often represent movement, modernity, industry, and the world that keeps carrying people away. For Rains Fall, the train is not adventure. It is displacement, return, departure, uncertainty. The same technology that helps bind the modern nation together also carries displaced people through landscapes that no longer belong to them safely. The train station scene is quiet because Rains Fall's ending is not dramatic in the usual way. There is no duel, no final speech to a crowd, no revenge. There is an old man and a train, memory and uncertainty. That quietness fits him perfectly. His story has always been about the spaces between loud events, the ride between missions, the words before violence, the grief after battle, the return after exile. He ends, not with thunder, but with departure. Rains Fall's full lore is therefore a story of failed protection, but not failed love. He fails to save eagle flies, but he never fails to love him. He fails to keep the Wapiti on their land, but he never fails to understand what the land means. He fails to stop Dutch's manipulation, but he sees it. He fails to make the army honourable, but he does not become dishonourable himself. The world defeats many of his goals. It does not fully defeat his character. This distinction is important. A character can lose everything and still remain morally victorious in a quiet sense. Rains Fall does not win the political battle. He does not win the family battle. He does not win the land battle. But he refuses to let grief turn him into a man like Dutch, Favors, or Cone. He remains Rains Fall. In a story where many men become worse under pressure, remaining oneself can be its own form of strength. His relationship to Arthur shows this strength at work. Arthur is a man who has done terrible things, but Rains Fall does not reduce him to those things. He speaks with him as a person capable of choice. This is one of the gifts Arthur receives late in life, to be seen not as a weapon, not as Dutch's son, not as a wanted man, but as a suffering human being who can still do less harm. Rainsfall's gentleness gives Arthur room to be better. Arthur, in return, gives Rainsfall action. He retrieves sacred items. He helps Monroe. He tries, in some paths, to avoid unnecessary killing. He listens. He cannot save eagle flies or Wapiti, but he can offer moments of aid. This exchange is small compared with the scale of injustice, but small things matter in Red Dead Redemption 2. A single act of mercy does not fix the world. It still matters because someone receives it. Rainsfall also belongs to the game's critique of Dutch's idea of freedom. Dutch speaks as if freedom means escaping laws and living outside civilization. Rainsfall's story shows that freedom for a people means something deeper: land, ceremony, safety, self-determination, continuity, and the right not to be provoked into destruction. Dutch's freedom is personal and romantic. Rainsfall's freedom is communal and endangered. The contrast makes Dutch's language feel painfully shallow. The Wapiti storyline also complicates the idea of civilization. The army represents civilization in uniform, but its actions are cruel. Cornwall represents industry and progress, but his greed helps drive dispossession. St. Denis represents sophistication, but its powerful rooms treat native suffering as a political inconvenience. Rainsfall stands among these forces and reveals that civilization can be another name for organised taking. Yet the story does not romanticize violence outside civilization as pure either. Dutch, Micah, Culm, and many gangs show that lawless spaces can be brutal too. Rainsfall's wisdom is not a simple rejection of all order. It is a demand for justice, respect, and survival. He does not want chaos. He wants promises honoured. He wants his people to live. That is why his position feels morally grounded. Rainsfall's grief is different from Arthur's guilt, but the two emotions meet. Arthur is guilty for what he has done. Rainsfall is grieving what has been done to his people and family. Arthur needs to learn responsibility. Rainsfall needs the world to stop punishing responsibility. Their conversations bring guilt and grief into the same quiet space, where neither can be solved, but both can be understood. This understanding is one of the reasons their ride is so memorable. It is not a mission remembered for mechanics alone. It is remembered because two men speak slowly while the land moves around them. The mountains, plants, wolves, sacred objects, and distant conflict all become part of a moral conversation. Red Dead Redemption 2 is at its best in moments like this, where the world slows enough for meaning to rise without being forced. Rainsfall's story can also be heard as a warning about outsiders who arrive late and leave early. Arthur becomes involved near the end. Dutch becomes involved for selfish reasons. Monroe helps but remains part of the army. Miller sympathises but remains a writer outside the tribe's full reality. The Wapiti are the ones who must live with the consequences after outsiders move on. Rainsfall understands this, which is why he is careful about whom to trust. Dutch is especially dangerous, because he arrives with the energy of an ally, but the priorities of a fugitive. He can tell eagle flies that action is needed, then ride away when the cost lands on Wapiti bodies. Rainsfall knows this pattern, because oppressed people have often been used by outsiders with their own agendas. The story makes Dutch's manipulation feel historically familiar, not merely personally bad. Arthur's difference is that he does not try to lead the Wapiti. He helps in smaller ways and listens. This humility comes partly from sickness, partly from his growing disillusionment, and partly from Rainsfall's influence. Arthur's best late actions are often those where he stops trying to dominate the story. He helps people move towards safety. With Rains Full, he learns again that help is not the same as control. His son's death also reveals the cost of young men being offered heroic narratives. Dutch offers one kind: fight, resist, make noise, strike back. The army offers another from the opposite side: rebel savages must be put down. Both narratives simplify eagle flies. Rains Fall sees the person under the narrative, his son, brave and wounded, deserving a future beyond becoming a symbol in someone else's story. Eagle Flies becomes a symbol anyway, because death often does that. He becomes the brave son, the fallen warrior, the image of resistance crushed. Rains Fall's grief reminds us that before he is any symbol, he is a child to someone. This is one of the most humanizing functions of Rains Fall. He pulls political tragedy back into the body of a father holding his son. The end credit eagle image then lets symbol and love meet in a softer way. Eagle Flies' name becomes visual memory, not military propaganda or gang manipulation. Rains Fall looks upward, and the image suggests that the son's spirit or meaning has not been entirely captured by the forces that killed him. The game cannot restore him, but it can give his father a skyward sign. That is not justice, it is elegy. Elegy is the right word for Rains Fall's whole arc. His story mourns while still speaking. It remembers what is gone without pretending memory is enough. It moves slowly because grief moves slowly. It carries beauty because the land is beautiful, the language is beautiful, the father-son love is beautiful, and Arthur's late listening is beautiful. But the beauty never erases the damage. Rains Fall's lore is beautiful the way a funeral song can be beautiful. The quietness of Rains Fall also makes him easy to overlook beside louder characters. Dutch burns across the screen. Micah provokes. Sadie erupts. Eagle Flies charges. Arthur coughs, fights, and redeems himself. Rains Fall speaks softly, asks for restraint, and carries grief, but quiet characters can hold the deepest moral weight. He is not loud because his story does not need volume. It needs attention. Attention is exactly what Arthur gives him when Arthur is at his best. He listens on the ride, he notices the plants, he sees the sacred items matter, he hears the grief. This listening is part of Arthur's redemption because it means he has stopped making every situation about Dutch's plan. Rains Fall helps Arthur become someone who can receive another person's sorrow without immediately turning it into action for himself. That is a different kind of masculinity than the one Arthur was raised in. Dutch taught performance, loyalty, strength, and violence wrapped in ideals. Rains Fall models grief, patience, and responsibility without performance. He does not need to prove he is a man by escalating every insult. He proves strength by absorbing pain without turning it outward recklessly. Arthur needs to see that before he can fully reject Dutch's version of strength. This makes Rains Fall one of the hidden teachers of Red Dead Redemption 2. He teaches Arthur, but he also teaches the story itself how to slow down. His missions ask for less shooting, more listening, more care, more awareness of consequences. They are late-game missions that arrive when the main plot is becoming frantic, and their slowness feels almost like a moral interruption. The game pauses the collapse long enough to ask whether anyone can still choose restraint. The answer is partial. Arthur can choose restraint in moments. Rainsfall chooses it again and again. Eagle Flies cannot bear it. Dutch rejects it. Fabers exploits it. The world punishes it. But the fact that restraint does not fully win does not make it meaningless. The game is too honest for that. Some good choices do not change history. They still change the person making them and the people touched directly by them. Arthur's choice to help Rainsfall can be seen as one of those good choices. It does not save Wapiti. It does not save Eagle Flies. It does not cure Arthur. But it matters to Rainsfall, to Monroe, to the sacred objects, to Arthur's own soul. In a story where total victory is impossible, local mercy becomes precious. Rainsfall's missions are built from local mercy under historical defeat. The idea of historical defeat is essential. Rainsfall's story is not written like a fair contest where better strategy might guarantee success. The forces against him are too large and too entrenched. The army, government, industry, and settler society all press in. This does not mean choices do not matter. It means choices happen inside unequal power. Rainsfall's dignity lies in choosing as carefully as possible when the game has been rigged long before he enters the scene. This rigged condition is what separates his tragedy from Dutch's. Dutch loses because his dream is unsustainable, his pride is enormous, and his choices become worse. Rainsfall loses because the world is organised against his people's survival on their own terms. Dutch's tragedy is internal collapse under pressure. Rainsfall's is external injustice endured with internal grace. Both are sad, but not morally the same. Rainsfall's grace does not mean he is emotionless. His voice carries sorrow. His concern for Eagle Flies is urgent. His pain after the sacred objects are stolen is visible. His epilogue uncertainty is raw. He has emotions, he simply does not let them command every action. That distinction matters, because people sometimes mistake calm for absence of feeling. Rainsfall feels deeply. He has simply learned that feeling alone cannot be allowed to steer a whole people into destruction. The burden of being misunderstood by one's own son may be one of his hardest burdens. Eagle Flies may see patience as weakness, and Rainsfall must keep loving him through that judgment. This is parental suffering at its most mature. He does not stop loving his son because his son rejects his counsel. He does not humiliate him publicly. He tries again and again to reach him. His love remains steady even when obedience disappears. The young warrior's loss of faith in him is also painful because leadership depends on trust. Rainsfall's authority is being eroded not only by the army but by the visible failure of diplomacy. He is squeezed from both sides. Outside power makes peace ineffective, and internal frustration makes peace look shameful. This is how oppressive systems fracture communities. They create conditions where the leader trying to prevent disaster becomes blamed for the disaster's slow arrival. Rainsfall's patience must therefore carry loneliness. He stands for a path many around him no longer believe in. That loneliness is different from Arthur's loneliness, but it echoes. Arthur begins to see Dutch clearly before everyone else does. Rainsfall sees the trap before Eagle Flies fully accepts it. Both men experience the isolation of being right too early, or at least of seeing danger before the people they love are ready to turn away. The difference is that Arthur was complicit in the danger he now sees, while Rain's Fall is responding to danger imposed from outside. Arthur must repent. Rain's Fall must endure. Their forms of suffering are not identical, and the story does not flatten them. Instead, their meeting allows each to illuminate the other. Arthur's guilt becomes more visible beside Rain's Fall's grief. Rain's Fall's restraint becomes more visible beside Arthur's violent past. When Arthur finally helps John, Abigail and Jack, Rain's Fall's influence can be felt indirectly. Arthur chooses a path of preservation over revenge. He cannot save everyone. He focuses on who can still be moved toward life. This is very close to Rain's Fall's moral world. Save what can still be saved. Reduce harm where possible. Do not let pride decide who dies. Arthur's final choices are his own, but Rain's Fall is one of the people who helps make them imaginable. Rain's Fall also contrasts with Captain Monroe in an interesting way. Monroe is a good man inside an unjust structure. Rain's Fall is a good leader outside that structure, negotiating with it for survival. Monroe's decency is individual. Rain's Fall's responsibility is communal. Monroe risks career and safety. Rain's Fall risks the fate of his people with every decision. Their alliance is meaningful, but unequal in burden. Rain's Fall cannot simply resign from being Wapiti. Evelyn Miller too can speak, write and advocate, but Rain's Fall must live the consequences. This does not make Miller useless. His sympathy matters, and his introduction helps connect Arthur to the Wapiti. But Rain's Fall's story reminds us that allyship from outsiders is fragile if it does not become material help. Words must become medicine, protection, land, safety, or action that reduces harm. Otherwise, sympathy remains a room in St. Denis where powerful people continue sipping drinks. The Sacred Objects mission is one of the places where sympathy becomes material. Arthur can physically retrieve what was taken. That is why the mission matters. It is not just a conversation about respect. It is respect enacted through risk and restraint. Rain's Fall does not need Arthur to admire Wapiti spirituality from a distance. He needs the stolen items returned without escalating the violence around his people. The owl feather trinket, given for retrieving the sacred items without killing, is a beautiful symbol because it rewards restraint through a sacred feeling object. An owl often carries associations with wisdom, night and watchfulness, and whether one reads it symbolically or simply as a game object, it fits Rain's Fall's presence. The gift marks a moment where Arthur has chosen the path Rain's Fall asked for. Not weakness, not inaction, but careful action. Careful action is the phrase that best describes Rain's Fall. He acts, but carefully. He loves, but carefully. He resists, but carefully. He grieves, but carefully. The world around him treats care as slowness, and slowness as weakness. Yet his care is exactly what makes him strong. He knows that careless action by the powerless is often what the powerful are waiting for. The tragedy is that careful action can still be overrun by careless power. Favours does not need to be as wise as Rain's Fall to hurt him. Cornwall does not need to understand Wapiti ceremony to profit from land. Dutch does not need to love eagle flies to use him. This is one of the cruelest realities the game shows. Wisdom is not always matched with power. Often fools and villains hold the levers while wise people hold the consequences. Rain's Fall's law should therefore be remembered with anger as well as sadness. His gentleness should not make the injustice around him feel gentle. The army's actions are cruel. The pressure on Wapiti is unjust. The theft of sacred objects is a violation. The withholding or obstruction of medicine is monstrous. Dutch's manipulation is selfish. Eagle Fly's death is not merely unfortunate. It is the result of many forces pushing a young man toward a battlefield his father tried to avoid. At the same time, Rainsfall's own emotional tone prevents the story from becoming simple rage. He carries anger, but he does not let anger become the whole of him. That is not because anger would be undeserved. It is because he understands what happens when anger becomes the only language left. The Wapiti need more than rage to survive. They need memory, medicine, elders, children, horses, food, ceremony, and time. Rage may defend dignity for a moment. It cannot raise the dead. This is why the father-son tragedy never resolves cleanly. Eagle Fly's anger is morally understandable, but Rainsfall's fear is historically justified. The son dies bravely. The father survives broken. Neither outcome proves a simple lesson like fight or do not fight. Instead, the story asks us to feel the cruelty of a world where both fighting and not fighting can end in loss. Rainsfall's wisdom lives inside that cruelty. The epilogue does not remove that cruelty, but it gives Rainsfall the dignity of continued presence. He is still alive in 1907. He can still speak. He can still remember Arthur. He can still travel. He can still look up at the sky. Survival is not glamorous, but it is a refusal of total erasure. The Wapiti did not vanish entirely from the story. Rainsfall carries them beyond the main tragedy. The phrase "I don't know why" around his return from Canada, if remembered in spirit, may be one of his most human moments. Leaders are expected to know, chiefs are expected to guide, fathers are expected to explain. But grief often brings people to places without giving them a reason clear enough to say. Rainsfall admitting uncertainty makes him more human, not less wise. Sometimes the old heart travels before the mind writes the map. Annisburg's train station, with its smoke and hard industry, is an especially lonely place for that uncertainty. It is not Wapiti. It is not a ceremonial space. It is not a home. It is a node in a modern network, a place to arrive and leave. Rainsfall standing there feels like a man temporarily placed inside the machinery that helped displace him. The image is quiet enough to miss, but once noticed, it hurts. John's kindness in that encounter matters because it honours Arthur's memory. John is not Arthur, and he does not carry the same relationship with Rainsfall. But he can listen. Listening is one of the few respectful things left to offer. The old chief's story cannot be fixed by John, but it can be heard. In a world that refused to listen to Rainsfall when listening might have mattered, even late listening has a small dignity. Rainsfall's end credit image with the eagle gives the story a final wordless prayer. It does not answer policy, restore land, or undo death. It simply lets the father see an image of flight. This is powerful because Rainsfall's story has been full of downward pressure, land taken, people pushed, grief falling, rain falling, hope falling. The eagle rises. For a moment, the story allows upward motion. This upward motion does not cancel Rainsfall's name. Rain is still needed. Rain falls, and falling rain gives life. The father's path was not lesser because it moved downward, patiently, toward the earth. Eagle flies and Rainsfall are two forms of sacred movement, rising and descending, fire and water, urgency and endurance. The tragedy is that history forced them into conflict, when a healthy world would have needed both. A people needs eagle flies. It needs young courage, resistance, and refusal to accept humiliation as natural. A people also needs rain's foal. It needs memory, patience, medicine, restraint, and the long view. The Wapiti tragedy is partly that colonial pressure turns these necessary forces against each other. The father and son should have been complementary. The world makes them oppositional. This is one of the deepest readings of their story. Rain's fall is not the opposite of eagle flies in a moral sense. He is the other half of a wounded community's survival instinct. Eagle flies says, "We cannot keep taking this." Rain's fall says, "We cannot survive the trap they are setting." Both are forms of love under pressure. The tragedy is that love does not always agree with itself when the future is being stolen. Arthur, watching them, also sees his own gang in another form. Dutch says, "Fight, have faith, make noise, follow me." Hosea, before his death, often counsels caution. Arthur stands between inherited loyalty and growing doubt. John must choose between gang and family. Everywhere in chapter 6, young men and old leaders are arguing over survival. Rain's fall and eagle flies make that argument clearer, because the stakes are communal and historically grounded. The Wapiti storyline also reveals Charles Smith's moral importance. Charles, who is of Native and African American heritage, shows deep concern for the Wapiti and asks Arthur to speak with Rain's Fall. Charles understands the danger of Dutch's involvement and the injustice facing the tribe. His presence helps connect Arthur to Rain's Fall in a way that feels morally trustworthy. When Charles points Arthur towards someone, Arthur should listen. Charles is one of the clearest moral compasses in the gang. Charles's respect for Rain's Fall matters because both men share a quiet seriousness about land, people, and dignity. Charles is younger and more physically active, but he understands restraint better than many. He is not afraid of violence, yet he does not worship it. This makes him spiritually closer to Rain's Fall than to Dutch. Arthur's friendship with Charles and his conversations with Rain's Fall both help pull him away from the gang's worst habits. The fact that Charles later helps the Wapiti and remains connected to their struggle shows that Rain's Fall's story extends beyond Arthur. Arthur's involvement is important, but he is not the centre of Wapiti life. Charles, Monroe, Miller, Eagle Flies, and the community itself all form a wider web. Rain's Fall's law should not reduce him to Arthur's teacher only. He is that, but he is first a chief and father within his own people's crisis. The story's decision to give Rain's Fall an epilogue encounter is therefore important. It lets him exist beyond Arthur's death. Many characters touched by Arthur continue, and Rain's Fall is one of them. This continuation respects him as more than a chapter 6 device. He survives into John's time, carrying grief that the main plot could not close. The world after Arthur is still full of unresolved people. Unresolved is the honest word for Rain's Fall. His story does not resolve in victory. It does not resolve in revenge. It does not resolve in healing. It resolves, if at all, in continued life and memory. He has lost Eagle Flies, left for Canada, returned briefly, and looked toward the sky. That is not a clean ending. It is an ending that understands exile and grief, rarely closed neatly. Rain's Fall's entire presence changes the emotional meaning of chapter 6. Without him, the chapter might be only Arthur's illness, Dutch's collapse, Micah's treachery, and the gang's final fracture. With him, the chapter becomes larger. It places the gang's tragedy beside a national tragedy, the death of an outlaw family beside the dispossession of a people. This larger frame makes Dutch's problems look smaller, and Arthur's final mercy more urgent. Arthur's illness is personal. Wapiti's crisis is collective. The game lets these two scales meet without making them compete. Arthur can be dying, and still another people's suffering can matter. This is part of his late moral awakening. The world does not become only his pain because he is dying. In fact, dying helps him see other pain more clearly. Rain's Fall is one of the people who opens that view. There is a humble beauty in the fact that Rain's Fall does not need Arthur to save him completely. He needs help, but he is not waiting for a white outlaw saviour to solve Wapiti history. Arthur cannot solve it. The story is stronger because it knows that Arthur can retrieve, steal medicine, listen, warn and help in limited ways. Rain's Fall remains the leader of his own people, not a rescued symbol. This limitation protects the emotional truth of the storyline. A full rescue would be false. The history being echoed is too large, the injustice too structural. Arthur's help matters exactly because it is local and incomplete. Rain's Fall's dignity remains intact because the story does not pretend his people's survival depends only on Arthur. He stands before Arthur arrives and continues after Arthur dies. Rain's Fall's leadership can also be understood through the things he chooses not to perform. He does not perform certainty when the future is uncertain. He does not perform strength as loudness. He does not perform grief as spectacle. He does not perform politics as theatre. In a story full of men trying to appear larger than they are, Rain's Fall often appears exactly as burdened as he is. That honesty gives him a quiet authority Dutch lacks. Dutch is almost always performing toward someone, toward the gang, toward enemies, toward himself, toward the imagined history that will one day understand him. Rain's Fall speaks as a man whose performance has been stripped away by responsibility. He does not need to invent romance around suffering. He has suffering enough. This contrast matters because Arthur has spent his life under Dutch's theatrical fatherhood. Rain's Fall's plain sorrow becomes a different kind of truth. The Wapiti community around Rain's Fall helps keep him from becoming only an individual moral symbol. He is not simply a wise man standing alone in the mountains. He belongs to people, the elderly who need medicine, the young men who follow eagle flies, the women and children who must live with each decision, the horses, tents, fires, ceremonies, and paths of the reservation all surround his choices. His wisdom is communal, because his burden is communal. This is why his grief is never only private. A private father could mourn eagle flies in the privacy of a home. Rain's Fall mourns as a chief whose son's death also means a wound to the future of the tribe. Eagle Flies is not only his child, he is also a young leader others followed. Losing him hurts the family and the people at once. Rain's Fall's face must carry both forms of loss, and neither form gives the other any mercy. The Wapiti elders matter in this quiet background because they represent memory under threat. When older people are sick, when medicine is withheld, when relocation looms, a culture's memory is endangered, along with its bodies. Rain's Fall's concern for the elderly is not only compassion for frail individuals, though it is that. It is also concern for continuity. Elders carry stories, language, ceremony, and warnings the young may need after the current crisis passes. The young warriors matter because they represent future energy under pressure. Their anger is dangerous, but it is also proof that humiliation has not completely broken them. Rainsfall does not want that energy extinguished. He wants it to survive long enough to become leadership rather than a grave. This is another painful part of his position. He is not against his young men. He is trying to keep them from being consumed by the enemy's preferred battlefield. The sacred items stolen by soldiers become even more meaningful in this community context. A pipe, a relic, or a ceremonial object is not simply old material. It is a shared point of connection between generations. When soldiers steal such items, they are not only insulting Rainsfall personally, they are interfering with a people's relationship to memory. The theft says, even what you use to remember who you are can be handled by us as loot. Arthur's recovery of those items therefore becomes a rare moment where theft is answered by return instead of counter theft for profit. The direction of movement changes. Something sacred has been taken from the community, and Arthur helps bring it back. That reversal may seem small beside land theft and military pressure, but small restorations matter because they resist the feeling that every loss is permanent. Rainsfall knows too much is being lost. He still honours what can be restored. The mission title, Archaeology for Beginners, has an interesting irony. Archaeology often studies the material remains of cultures from the outside, after distance or death has made them objects of curiosity. But Rainsfall is not a dead culture's artefact. He is a living leader whose sacred objects are being treated as if they can be collected, studied, or mishandled by outsiders. The title quietly brushes against the danger of turning living people into relics before they are gone. Rainsfall resists that by speaking as a living man, not an exhibit. He is not there to be admired as a symbol of the past. He is fighting for a present and a future. The Wapiti are not ancient scenery. They are people dealing with immediate hunger, sickness, politics, grief, and fear. This is why the stolen relics hurt. The army's contempt tries to freeze Wapiti identity into objects while ignoring living Wapiti needs. The herbs Rainsfall gathers also resist that freezing. They show living knowledge in practice. This is not a museum display of tradition. It is medicine being gathered for people who are sick now. Knowledge of plants is not nostalgia, it is survival. Rainsfall's relationship to the land is active, useful, and present tense. The land remembers the people, and the people know how to ask the land for help. Arthur's own history as a hunter and observer makes this lesson land quietly. He knows something about tracking, plants, animals, weather, and wilderness survival, but Rainsfall frames that knowledge differently. For Arthur, the land has often been a place to hide, hunt, travel, or draw. For Rainsfall, it is also a sacred relationship and communal inheritance. The difference does not humiliate Arthur, it expands him. This expansion matters because Arthur's last chapter is full of narrowing elsewhere. His health narrows. Dutch's trust narrows. The gang's options narrow. Time narrows. Yet through Rainsfall, Arthur's moral field widens. He sees beyond the gang, beyond his own approaching death, beyond Dutch's drama. The dying man becomes capable of larger attention at the very moment his body is becoming smaller. Rainsfall's story also reframes the idea of a father saving a son. Dutch fails his sons by using them. Rainsfall fails to save Eagle Flies despite loving him. This difference is painful but essential. Not every failed protection is the same. Dutch fails because his ego overtakes love. Rain's Full fails because love is facing power it cannot fully defeat. The results both involve lost sons, but the moral meanings are completely different. Arthur can sense this difference because he has spent his life trying to be a good son to Dutch. By chapter 6, he is beginning to understand that Dutch's fatherhood was conditional in ways he did not want to see. Rain's Full's grief for Eagle Flies shows what unconditional fatherly love looks like under catastrophe. It does not save the son, but it never stops seeing him as a son. Dutch, by contrast, increasingly sees sons as loyal or disloyal. That contrast helps explain why Arthur turns so fiercely towards saving John. John is not a perfect brother or son. He has failed Abigail and Jack. He has run away before. But Arthur learns, late, that family cannot mean only obedience to a leader. Family must mean protecting the chance of life when the leader's dream becomes death. Rain's Full's love for Eagle Flies sits quietly behind that lesson, like a mountain in the distance. The Wapiti storyline also deepens the idea of relocation that appears throughout the game. Dutch's gang relocates constantly to escape consequence. The Wapiti are pressured to relocate because power wants their land. These are not the same. Dutch's movement is chosen within criminal flight, even if under pressure. Wapiti movement is forced by dispossession. Placing these forms of movement beside each other makes the gang's complaints about freedom feel smaller and more morally complicated. Rain's Full is not trying to find one more temporary camp. He is trying to preserve a people's relationship to home. This makes Wapiti different from Coulter, Horseshoe, Clements Point, or Shady Bell. Those camps are temporary by nature. Wapiti is treated as temporary by outsiders who have no right to make it so. Rain's Full's sorrow comes from watching others turn home into a negotiable inconvenience. Home for Rain's Full is not only shelter, it is where the dead are remembered, where ceremonies make sense, where children learn the world, where plants are known, where mountains carry stories, and where the people are not merely surviving but belonging. Losing such a home is not the same as moving camp after a botched robbery. It is a wound in identity. The game lets this difference sit quietly but clearly. This difference also makes the epilogue line about Canada heavier. Canada is not simply a new map marker. It is survival outside the original frame of belonging. Rain's Full may have people with him there, and that matters, but exile still leaves a question in the heart. Where does a leader belong when the land he fought to preserve has been taken or made unsafe? His return to Annesburg suggests that the question never stopped hurting. Annesburg itself is not a place of healing. Its smoke, mines and hard labour make it feel like an industrial wound in the landscape. Rain's Full appearing there is almost cruelly fitting because industry is part of what has been devouring his world. The train station is not a sacred place, yet it becomes a place of quiet memory because he stands there. His presence briefly makes the industrial town hold a grief older than coal and wages. Rain's Full's final moments in the credits, watching the eagle, offer something Annesburg cannot. The image moves away from industry and back towards sky, mountain and symbol. It gives him, and the story, a more fitting visual language. The train station shows exile in the modern world. The eagle shows memory beyond that world. Both images are needed. One shows what history did, the other shows what grief still reaches for. The eagle also returns the story to the natural world that Rain's Fall has always understood better than the men exploiting it. The army sees territory. Cornwall's world sees resources. Dutch sees opportunity. Rain's Fall sees signs, medicine, memory, and kinship. When the eagle flies, the natural world briefly speaks in the only language large enough for his grief. It does not explain, it appears. That appearance is enough, because Rain's Fall's story has never been about perfect answers. It is about endurance without answers. Why do promises break? Why do sons die? Why does wisdom fail to protect? Why does home become exile? The game does not answer these questions neatly. It lets Rain's Fall carry them. The eagle does not answer either. It gives the questions a place to rise. This is what makes Rain's Fall such a powerful figure for a slow telling. His life asks for quiet, because loudness has failed him so often. The loud men bring plans, orders, insults, guns, speeches, and explosions. Rain's Fall brings a slower moral weather, herbs gathered by hand, sacred items returned, warning spoken to a son, grief held without spectacle, and a final look toward the sky. His story lowers the voice without lowering the stakes. His lore is also a reminder that not every great character needs many missions. Rain's Fall's importance is concentrated. A few conversations, a ride, a handful of choices, a son's death, an epilogue meeting, a credit image. That is enough, because each moment is heavy with context. He does not need constant screen time. He needs attention when he appears. The story trusts quiet scenes to carry enormous history. Rain's Fall remains memorable because he gives the game one of its clearest images of moral patience under historical pressure. He does not win, but he teaches. He does not save Eagle Flies, but he loves him truthfully. He does not stop the army, but he exposes its cruelty. He does not redeem Arthur, but he helps Arthur understand the shape of gentler action. His losses are great, and still his presence is not empty. It is full of meaning. The theme of incomplete help is everywhere in Red Dead Redemption 2. Arthur helps Charlotte, but cannot remove all danger from her life. He helps the Downs family, but cannot undo Thomas's suffering. He helps John, but cannot guarantee John's permanent safety. He helps Rain's Fall, but cannot save Eagle Flies or Wapiti land. The game treats redemption as meaningful without making it omnipotent. Rain's Fall's story is one of the clearest examples. Rain's Fall also deepens the meaning of Arthur's final phrase about trying. Arthur cannot become perfect. He cannot fix history. He cannot heal every wound. But he can try, and trying matters more when the world is unjust. Rain's Fall has been trying for years, perhaps decades, under impossible conditions. Arthur's late effort joins that larger human pattern, not victory, not purity, but trying to reduce harm before the dark closes in. The calm in Rain's Fall's scenes is therefore not an escape from tragedy. It is a way of facing tragedy without letting it dictate the soul's shape. That is why his story fits a sleep channel so naturally, though the words should never announce that inside the telling. He speaks slowly, because grief has taught him pace. He moves gently, because force has already done enough damage. His lore can be told softly, because softness is part of his resistance. Softness as resistance is one of Rain's Fall's most beautiful qualities. The world wants him to become either broken or violent. He becomes neither, at least not in the way his enemies expect. He remains gentle without being naive, sorrowful without being empty, patient without being passive. That combination is rare in Red Dead Redemption 2, where so many people answer pain by sharpening themselves. Rain's fall remains rain. Rain can seem weak beside guns, but rain changes land. It feeds roots, wears stone, cools heat, and carries memory through seasons. Rainfall's name becomes a metaphor for endurance that does not need to look like conquest. Eagle flies is the flash of motion. Rain's fall is the long weather. The story mourns that both were trapped by a world that would not allow them to protect each other. By the end, Rain's fall is one of the loneliest survivors in the game. John has Abigail and Jack for a time. Sadie has work and movement. Charles seeks a future elsewhere. Rain's fall has his people, but he has lost his son and his home landscape. Survival with people and survival inside loneliness can coexist. A chief can still be surrounded by community and carry a grief no one else can fully enter. This loneliness is visible in the epilogue, because Rain's fall seems quieter than ever. He is alive, but diminished by history. Not diminished in dignity, but in what the world has taken. He has the bearing of someone still noble, but nobility does not fill the empty place of a dead child. His survival is not triumphant, it is weathered. Weathered is perhaps the best final word for him. Rain's fall is weathered by age, loss, politics, betrayal, exile and fatherhood. But weathered wood can still stand. Weathered stone can still hold shape. Weathered faces can still carry kindness. The world has passed over him harshly, and he remains recognisable. That endurance is his quiet victory. The law of Rain's fall is therefore not only what happens to him, it is what he refuses to become. He refuses to become a tool for Dutch. He refuses to become the rage Favours wants to provoke. He refuses to stop loving eagle flies even when his son rejects his path. He refuses to treat sacred things as small. He refuses to let Arthur's violent past prevent him from seeing the man's suffering. He refuses, as long as he can, to abandon the hope that survival can be chosen over spectacle. And now the mountain air can grow still. The fires at Wapiti can lower into embers. The herbs can rest in Rainsfall's hands. The sacred pipe can return to its people. The train at Annesburg can wait under a smoky sky. Somewhere above the ridges, an eagle can move through the cold light, and an old father can look upward without needing to explain what the sight means. Rainsfall's story is one of patience under pressure, grief without surrender, and love that could not save everything, but still remained love. Let the roads quiet now. Let the argument between father and son soften into memory. Let Arthur ride on with one more lesson held close. Rest now, and let the rain fall gently over the dark.